Hey, 7th graders, Mr. Allard with another one of your video lessons. Today we're going to be talking about North and South strengths and weaknesses before the Civil War. As always, you should already have cut out and taped in your interactive notebook our graphic organizer, which is going to be number 102 in your interactive notebook. Should be relatively simple. You're going to make your own bullet points. You're going to jot down your own notes in each of the boxes. Make sure the titles line up with the titles of the slides. Should be easy peasy. Answer the questions at the end. Use your notes when you answer the questions. That's what they're there for. Should be getting a whatever out of whatever. If it's 5 questions, 6 questions, whatever. All right, here we go. I'm going to slide in here. Okay, so North or Union strengths. One of the biggest strengths that they had is they just had a ton of people. Through urbanization, through immigration, the North's population at the start of the Civil War was somewhere around 20 estimates, low end 21 million, high end 23, 24 million people. So that just meant they could have more people fight during the war. They had more able bodies, and actually during the war, despite the fact that they're losing men on the battlefield, their population is growing. We talked about this immigration. Lots of people coming from Ireland, lots of people coming from Germany, not so many people coming from England, but that was kind of the third place. And they're overwhelmingly coming to northern cities. As we look at that percentage on that chart below, you're seeing the only states with 20%, 10 to 20% of their population being immigrants is going to be states that were fighting with the North in the Civil War, which is going to swell the Union ranks and keep them having fresh troops throughout the war. Let me slide out of the way here. So one thing you need to fight a war is you need people for troops and things like that. The next thing you need is you need money and supplies. And the North had both of these. They had over 100,000 different factories that could be used to produce goods. And Lincoln, we're going to talk in another flip lesson, Lincoln was very good about going to these factories and saying, okay, well, um, you make buttons. Well, guess what? You're not making buttons in this factory anymore. You're making bayonets. You make shoes. You're going to be making boots for the war. You make iron products. Well, you're going to be making bullets, and you're going to be making rifles, and using that might of the northern economy to produce war materials. They had this manufacturing already in place. They didn't have to build it from scratch. Also, they had a financial system. They had a banking system. The government could easily get money to these manufacturers. The loans could be taken out for factories to expand, and they had their money was backed by gold, so they didn't have any big issues with dealing paper money or with inflation or things like that to be able to buy and purchase goods to use for the war effort. Railroads and telegraphs. The railroad we've already talked about. Obviously, you could again. One of the things that Lincoln did, we're going to talk a little bit more in depth, is he took control. The government took control of all the railroads in the North, and they could use those railroads to ship goods and and people to the front lines. It was 3 to 5 times faster using the railroads, depending on where you were, to transport troops and to transport goods. And plus, the troops would be fresh because they'd basically been sitting on a railroad. They had been marching for 2 to 3 weeks to get to where they needed to go. The telegram is going to be a new invention, and basically think of it like texting in a coded language. And we'll talk a little bit more about this. But what the North did, and what the South did too a little bit, is whenever they built railroads, they built telegraph lines next to it. And what this allowed people to do is it allowed people to talk across vast differences quickly. You could talk from New York to Chicago in as fast as you could decode a message. And this was really revolutionary to allow people to talk about orders, to talk about military issues, to talk about things like that to help with the war effort. The Union also had a strong Navy. About 100% of the Navy was under Union control when the Southern states started to secede. So that meant the South had to build their entire Navy from scratch. The Navy also had technology with what we call ironclads. We're going to talk about that when we talk about Civil War technology coming up. Um, and you can see a picture of an ironclad right there. Basically, what it said, they look like floating submarines. Cannonballs would deflect off them. They could ram into wooden chips. And the Union, obviously, as we talked about the factories, once they found out these things were usable, using steam power, not having to rely on sails, they could produce a ton of them using northern factories. Okay, so how about weaknesses? Well, one of the big Union weaknesses was they had weak leadership. Not with Lincoln. Lincoln was a very strong leader, and he was the epitome of that commander in chief. And some generals even warned that he was too hands-on with the war effort. He basically lived at the Washington D.C. telegraph office, sending telegraphs to the front, responding to telegraphs, being very, very hands-on with the war effort. Had to do with his generals. The joke went that Lincoln went through generals faster than he changed his underwear. And it was somewhat true. During the course of the war, there are 4 or 5 different leaders of the Union Army. He goes for Winfield Scott, he goes for McClellan, and it takes him a while until he finds that person who's really willing to use the Union might to their advantage in Ulysses S. Grant. The cause of the war. One of the famous sayings is this was a rich man's war fought by poor people. The North was never really aware of exactly what they were fighting for. They didn't really have a cause. They didn't really understand that, why are we trying to keep this country together if people want to leave? That wasn't something that many people got their heads around early on. They were fighting an offensive war, so they had to win. They were the aggressors here. They were the ones who declared war on the South. They were the ones who wanted the South to remain part of the Union. Also part of that offensive war is they had to win in the South. This is like in a sporting event, traveling and playing on the opponent's turf. If you're playing basketball at an away game, the rims are a little bit different. The floor, the lighting's a little bit different. The field may be a little bit different, and you're not that aware as the home team is. And that was a distinct disadvantage for the North throughout the war. Ooh, let me get up there. Southern strengths. About somewhere in the neighborhood of 3/4 of all the military schools were located in the South. The most of the officers in the Army at the point of secession were Southern men. Most of those Southern men, whether or not they believed in secession, could not fight against their homeland, like Robert E. Lee, like Stonewall Jackson, and they left and became members and generals in the Confederate Army. This gave the South very, very strong leadership, very, very capable leadership. Robert E. Lee was the general of the South throughout the entire Civil War, and quite frankly, without him, the South probably wouldn't have lasted as long. Spoiler alert, the South loses the Civil War, but we should have already known that going in. And the strong leadership really keeps the South of being able to handle their weaknesses that we'll talk about in a little bit. Ooh, I'm right in the middle of this map. Let's go up here. Confederacy strengths. They're fighting on their home turf. They're fighting to protect their homeland. They know what they're fighting for. They know the lay of the land. They're fighting to protect their way of life. That's going to give them kind of this. We talked about this a little bit with the Patriots during the American Revolution. They know what they're fighting for. They're willing to give up their lives to basically not only defend their homeland, but defend their way of life. Many people in the South felt that the Civil War was not only just a war, but it was really a war on the Southern way of life. And as you can see from the battle map there, only, I think, 2 of those battles on that map out of probably somewhere near, there's got to be close to 100 on that map, only 2 of them were fought in Northern Territory, and quite frankly, many of the battles were not fought in Northern states. Many of them were fought around Virginia, into the deep South, Georgia, Louisiana, around the Mississippi River. We'll talk about that when we get to war strategies. Another strength of the South was cotton. King Cotton again. The South is producing 75% of the world's cotton, and their ideas, they didn't need factories. They didn't need these places to make goods because Europe relied on their cotton. We send the cotton to Europe. We get war materials back, and we also form alliances because the Europe's economy depended largely on using southern cotton, so that the South's um, economic gains could help them throughout the war. Weaknesses for the South. Very few factories and railroads. The North had somewhere in the neighborhood of 21,000 miles of railroad. The South had somewhere in the neighborhood of 9,000. The North had over 100,000 factories. The South barely had 10,000 factories. And really, one historian said that there was only one factory in the South that could produce more goods than northern factories. In the North, there was over 75,000 factories that could produce more than the highest producing factory in the South. That was incredible, meaning the number of bullets, the number of rifles, the number of cannons produced in the North, astronomically bigger than what could be produced in the South. The South had a small population. They only had 9 million, not really big cities. Plus, you got to remember, over a third of that population is slaves. Think it would be a really good idea for the South to arm their slaves? Probably not. Who do you think they'd use those rifles on? The people who are trying to get the South back in the Union, or the people who are enslaving them? Probably going to be using against the people who are enslaving them. Finances, they depended on trade, so if they lost that trade, they're going to be in big trouble. They had few banks. They were what we would call cash poor, meaning that they relied on trade. They didn't have any money in reserve, any golden reserves to buy things they needed if they could not trade, or to produce more factories, or to invest in their economy. So as the war goes on, this is going to be a big problem for the South. All right, that's our flip lesson, or our video lesson for today. If you have any questions on anything we went over, make sure you're posting messages on the board for Schoology. You can direct message me on Schoology if you need it. Classmates will probably be the biggest help. Make sure you've answered all those questions. There's going to be a little spot at the bottom as well. Make sure that you're answering that question full sentences. What side do you think would be better equipped to win the war? Forget that you know how the war ends. Think about looking at the strengths and weaknesses and answer that question in probably 2 to 3 complete sentences. Rag it. Maybe provide some evidence from the chart to help you out. All right, till next time, 7th graders. Out it out.